In the Book of Nehemiah, we find the autobiographical testimony of Nehemiah the son of Hakaliah, and all that he strove to do for the benefit and the advantage of Jerusalem, for the people of God, and in his zeal and devotion to the one true God. The Book of Nehemiah in English Bibles is found as part of the historical writings as its independent book after Ezra and before the Book of Esther. It is, in the Hebrew Bible, part of the writings, connected to Ezra as one book, Ezra and Nehemiah, and coming almost toward the end, just before 1st and 2nd Chronicles. Nehemiah is living and is the chief cupbearer of the king Artaxerxes of Persia, and wherever he is, in Susa or whatever city he happens to find himself. As the cupbearer, he is a very important person because the cupbearer is the one keeping the wine of the king from being adulterated. And so, therefore, the person is in a very high position of public trust. It is a role that would suit him well in the endeavors that he would attempt to accomplish in Jerusalem at the time. And he would be doing this in the days somewhere between about 456, 432 BC. Right there, it's in the second half of the 5th century BC, mainly after the temple has been standing for 50 to 75 years, and Israel has been back on its land for almost a century. And so the beginning of the book tells us the situation at the beginning, that in the 20th year of the king Artaxerxes, he is in Susa, and Hanani, one of his relatives, came and told him about the situation in Jerusalem, how the remnant that is there are very under reproach and adversity. The wall of Jerusalem is breached and the gates have been burned down. And this led Nehemiah to deep, deep sadness. And he prayed to God. He confessed the sins of the people himself. And that he then asked God for an opportunity to have success, to show compassion in the presence of the king. And so then he goes to stand before the king as a cupbearer, and the king notices that he has a very sad appearance. And he responds, "Why would I not appear dejected when the city with the graves of my ancestors lies desolate and its gates destroyed by fire?" And the king then asked him, "What is it that you're asking?" And it's interesting how Nehemiah then says a quick prayer to God, and then says he would like to go back to Judah to rebuild the city that has the graves of his ancestors in it. The king asked how long it would take him. Nehemiah told him a time. Doesn't tell us how long here. He also wants letters to the satrap or governor of beyond the river, the province in which Judah is, so that he can go and do the work and have the timber needed and all of that to do the work he needs to do. And he's given all these things. But we're told in chapter 2 and verse 10 that when Sanballat the Horonite and Tobiah the Ammonite find out about this, they were very displeased that someone had come to seek the benefit for the Israelites. And this is going to be the constant theme for the rest of Nehemiah's testimony. So in Nehemiah 2 and 11, Nehemiah reaches Jerusalem. And after a couple of days, he doesn't tell anybody what he's doing. He goes with some of his officials and he goes around the city walls. He inspects their condition, and he sees what he needs to see. And then he tells them the problem on the next day in verse 17 when he gathered all the officials, saying, we need to rebuild the wall of Jerusalem so the reproach would not continue. He told how God had brought him to this point in this place in order to do this work. And they readied themselves to the project. They wanted to build the walls. But Sanballat the Horonite, Tobiah the Ammonite, Geshem the Arab derided them, expressed contempt toward them, suggesting they're rebelling against the king. But Nehemiah told them the God of heaven would prosper them, that they would do this rebuilding, that they had no just or ancient right in Jerusalem. Chapter 3, he will explain the names of the people doing the work along the walls and the various places they were at along the walls in terms of the various gates of the city. There were some Levites involved, and high priests even were involved, and regular people were involved. Well, people also came in from other villages to help with this work. In chapter 4, we learn more about the opposition, and Nehemiah will constantly lay out exactly how he was opposed in the work. That they first insult and deride the work that's being done, and God wants them to hear. Nehemiah wants God to hear it, and to bring that same reproach on their heads instead. And so they kept building up the work of the wall, half its height. And again, the opponents find out about these things, and they start conspiring to use armed forces against Jerusalem. Now, you might be wondering, wait a second, isn't this whole area under the Persian Empire and its authorities? And yes, it is. But I think sometimes we have the Roman Empire in mind too much, where the Romans have soldiers, they move everywhere, and we don't really see other forces around. In these days, you still have some of the petty kings, client kings that are ruling over some of these areas. That yes, the Persians are over all of it. They have their officials over it. But when it comes to a lot of the local level, it's still going to be local level officials and local level militias and armies. And so this shouldn't be too surprising. And there would be this kind of tribal conflicts going on. The Persians would do what they could to keep it from getting out of hand, but the Persians were not going to be positioned to try to get rid of all of this. And we need to remember that if Jerusalem is elevated in its standing and it gets its walls back and things, it will have a higher stature, and it will come at the disadvantage of the Ammonites, the Sumerians, the Phoenicians that are now in the Philistine areas, and the Arabs all around them. And that's why this opposition is there. And so now that there's this armed threat, now all of a sudden Nehemiah needs to have guards placed in case they come against this armed opposition. And now all the enthusiasm for the work meets some of the realities of the work, and the people start despairing because of just how much debris there is, how much work there is. And so this is a very critical time, and so Nehemiah makes sure to station people at the exposed places. He makes sure everybody who's working also has a sword on them. He makes sure that people are able to cry out, and there are people available in earshot all around the wall, so that if at some point some armed resistance comes up, that they can all gather together with their swords and fight it off. In fact, we're told they're not changing their clothes, and that they have their weapon even when they're getting drinks. They're always prepared to fight. And this kind of ability to show force was enough to frustrate the intentions of their enemies. Chapter 5 represents a pause in the labor, and it provides a very important point. In verse 14, Nehemiah will mention something that had not been mentioned yet. From the day I was appointed governor in the land of Judah. So he's not coming as just some kind of, I'm just the king's cupbearer. He is now commissioned as the governor of Judah. So he has an actual political commission here. And so because he is now the governor of Judah, he is now going to be addressed with all kinds of things going on. The thing that we find out very quickly is that the wealthy Jewish people have taken advantage of the situation, and they have taken collateral for debts from the young people, have sold the Jewish the children of Jewish people into slavery and things of that nature in order to have debts paid up. And Nehemiah does not take kindly to finding this out. Nehemiah's like, we paid a lot of money to buy back our Jewish people from Gentiles, and now you're going to sell them back into slavery the way to buy them back again. And so he publicly shames them, because again, this is one of those things that wealthy like to do to increase their gains, but not something they want to be seen publicly. When it's exposed publicly like this, they have no defense. They're made to be ashamed, and they swear and are made to swear in the front of the priest, and the priest should make sure they do it, that they're going to stop taking the cloud. They're not going to keep doing this. They're not going to exploit and oppress the poor of their own people. And Nehemiah wants us to see that he is coming here and doing things in order to maintain the justice that God would have them to maintain. He also tells us he's governor so that we're told, and he wants us to know that he does not take the food allotment the governor was to have. And he says previous governors would very liberally take from that allotment, which would come from the people, ultimately, the food from the people. And in fact, he even said he would feed people at his table frequently, but he would not take from the governor's allotment. And all of this, again, is as a testimony of the integrity of Nehemiah. Nehemiah really wants you to know, and really wants God to know. See, look at what I have done. Please remember me for good, oh my God, for all I have done for this people, in verse 19. That's the point of it. Chapter 6, we're back to the work of the wall. And chapter 6 is primarily about what the opponents are trying to do. That they try to take him away from the work to have a meeting with him in a plane somewhere. He's like, I'm too busy with this important work. They then come up with this letter saying that, you're trying to rebel against the king and set yourself up as a king. And people are saying, right? People are always saying. That's something we need to be careful about. And Nehemiah, that's just in the imagination of your own mind. They get a guy to try to get him to come meet in the temple secretly and privately because he's going to be killed. And Nehemiah's like, why should a man of my stature do this kind of thing? He saw through that it was actually an attempt to discredit him in the eyes of the people. That in fact there are these prophets and prophetesses, no idea the prophets and others who are trying to scare Nehemiah. So we still see people maintaining a prophetic office, and unfortunately we're still seeing people even at this time who have that office but are not using it for the most godly and righteous ends, which is unfortunate but also unfortunately normal. We're then told in chapter 6 verse 15 that after 52 days, on the 25th day of Elul, the wall was completed. And this, of course, completely caused their enemies to despair. And Nehemiah also wants you to know, though, that Tobiah is very well connected, and there's all kinds of letters going between him and the elite in Jerusalem at this time, and all of it probably speaking scandalously about Nehemiah and things of that nature. But Nehemiah was still able to persevere and to do the work. In chapter 7, we are told how Nehemiah wants to reestablish, make sure everything is set up properly. So he positions gatekeepers, singers, Levites, and put people in charge over Jerusalem, especially with the gates, to make sure they're properly defended and the walls are defended. He also finds the record of the exiles and who all came back among the exiles, and so he lists all that out, and that is the majority of chapter 7. So even though the wall is done, there's still a lot that Nehemiah wants to testify regarding the work he did as a governor. And in chapter 8, when the 7th month comes, he wants to have the law read before the people. And so Ezra and some of the other guys who know the law come and they stand up on this pedestal, on this platform for this purpose, and they read the law in verse 8, and they also explain it and impart insight. And the people gain understanding from what they read. This kind of explanation, we can imagine, would have involved things like maybe taking antiquated words and explaining their meaning. It may just involve giving examples or explaining what's going on with certain passages. That's the kind of thing that's being explained. And this is a very big fundamental shift. This is now when we start seeing this model that we're going to see for the rest of Second Temple Judaism, and even to this day, where we are coming to understanding what God is doing by considering the text of the message that God has provided, and that we read it, and that we have it interpreted, understood, that we can come to understanding what God is doing. Sure, that should have been going on in Israel beforehand. It was not really. It was mostly mediated through the prophets until this time. And the people were weeping after they heard this. And they were told to stop because this is a holy day, right? Because God has provided them the joy of the law and all these things. They should, in fact, enjoy sweet treats and give it sweet treats to those who don't have it in light of it. And then they found out when they were reading in the book that, in fact, it was the time for the Feast of Booths, the Feast of Tabernacles. And so they should be out living in the booths. And so they made sure to go do that. They go and they create all the temporary structures and they keep the Feast of Booths. And we're told, in fact, they kept it as it had not been kept since the day of Joshua, son of Nun. Which is almost a millennium, if we take the full chronology, which is a distressing, depressing thing. Now, that does not necessarily mean that the text is saying that the Feast of Booths had never been celebrated at all. It's just that it had not been celebrated to the same level, intensity, degree, with faithfulness between the days of Joshua and the days of Nehemiah. And that's kind of a sorry testimony in of itself. In chapter 9, in beginning of 10, we see the people come back. And they are really ratifying their covenant again with God. And we see in chapter 9 that there's this kind of prayer. And in this prayer, God is blessed. They testify about how God chose Abraham and how he delivered their ancestors out of Egypt, how they received the law, how he brought them into the land, how they were given the land, they had the kings and all these things. But of course also how the people had sinned and how their ancestors had sinned and how they were in this very difficult place. In fact, in verse 36, they say, "So today we are slaves, because our ancestors didn't follow your word, they didn't listen to you, and now we find ourselves in a position that we are slaves. In the very land you gave to our ancestors, we are slaves. Its abundant produce goes to the kings you have placed over us because of our sins." Very important testimony here that even though they're back in the land, right, there's been a fulfillment to a degree of what the prophets promised about the restoration, but it hasn't been fully restored. They're still living under these kings. They see themselves as slaves. They still see themselves in some form exiled from God. There's still something wrong here. But nevertheless, they here bind themselves in their covenant to God to observe the laws of Moses that had been given. And Nehemiah's name is on there on top in Nehemiah 10 and verse 1. And then all kinds of names are there. And all the people enter into this oath that they're going to follow the law and the commandments. And that includes things like in verse 3, they're not going to give their daughters in marriage to the neighboring peoples. They're not going to buy on the Sabbath. They're going to let the fields lie fallow in the 7th year. They're going to keep up the third of a shekel to keep the temple provisions going per person. And the Levites and priests also have talked about the offerings, how they're going to keep everything going on with the temple. The fact that these things are necessary in this period here, somewhere in the middle of the 4th century, when the temple's been around for 50, 75 years, and they've been back in the land for almost a century. It tells you that there's still these struggles maintaining the faithfulness here in the land. Chapter 11, we learned that because Jerusalem has been so run down that it wasn't well populated, and so we see the people who are willing to move into Jerusalem, and then those also who are living in the villages around Jerusalem in chapter 11. In chapter 12, we learn about the priests and Levites who are in Jerusalem. Then we have the story beginning in verse 27, the dedication of the wall. And Nehemiah evocatively talked about how there's 2 groups of singers with the instruments and everything, and they go around the walls, and they kind of go around the walls, and then they meet together. And it's a time of great joy and celebration for them and the people. And then in verse 44 through 47, Nehemiah wants to kind of reestablish the appropriate people in charge of the various facilities in the temple, like it had been set up in the days of David and Solomon and so on. Chapter 13 rounds out Nehemiah, and he's providing some of these commandments and some of the things that he's kind of set up in place. Also some of the follow-up work he needs to do. They found out in reading the book of Moses, probably in Numbers and Deuteronomy, that Ammonites and Moabites should not enter the assembly of God, and how there had been that. In fact, that Tobiah had been able to keep a storeroom in the temple. And in fact, we're told that Nehemiah had left Jerusalem at this time, and he comes back in the 32nd, after the 32nd year. He gone back in the 32nd year, but had to come back again, and he gave instructions to make sure this would not happen, that the temple would have the proper things in it, and not a storeroom or not an office for Tobiah, who's not even an Israelite. He found out the Levites weren't getting their portions, and was asking what on earth is going on here. He made sure that the proper people were in charge of storehouses, so those resources would be there so Levites could do their job. And we see in verse 14 again what he really wants. Please remember me for this, O my God. Do not wipe out the kindness that I have done for the temple of my God and its services. He saw beginning in verse 15 the people were not observing the Sabbath. People were in fact selling merchandise on the Sabbath. And he's like, do you not see how God has condemned us because we did not keep the Sabbath? And so he imposed restrictions by force to keep people from selling on the Sabbath and working on the Sabbath. And that was able to provide some benefit. And finally, he saw some of the fact that some of the people intermarried with people of the nations, and that they weren't even really speaking Hebrew anymore. They were speaking Aramaic, or the Canaanite dialects of the nations. And Nehemiah doesn't take this sitting down. He entered in a complaint with them. He called down a curse on them, struck them, and pulled out their hair, made them swear by God that they weren't going to keep doing this, that they would instead kind of maintain the marriage within the community, to maintain the Hebrew language, to maintain the customs and traditions of Moses, and not to just abandon themselves to the people all around. In fact, even the high priest's family had been doing that, married in with Sanballat the Horonite. Because again, we have this thing going on that we're seeing very clearly in Ezra and Nehemiah, where the centers of true zeal and dedication to the customs of God as given by Moses are among the exiled communities in Babylon, in other parts of the Persian Empire. That in the land of Judah, you've got a group of people who are probably just trying to survive. And so they're making the accommodations that they think they need to in order to survive, with a lot of forces around them that are probably more influential and stronger than they are. But when Nehemiah comes in, he comes with a lot of influence and power because he is the cupbearer of the king and now governor of Judah. He can much more strongly advocate for Judah and the Jewish people in a way that others had not, and that very much comes at the expense of guys like Sanballat, who probably were able to have a lot of influence, but Nehemiah is checking them. And so that's why we see Nehemiah and Sanballat especially at opposition here, that whatever comes to Nehemiah's advantage is going to come at Sanballat's disadvantage. And in the end, all of this is said, he says, to remember me for good, oh my God. That's what Nehemiah is trying to do here, talking about all that he's trying to do for the benefit of Jerusalem. That would have come at his own personal expense, that he's not doing this for his own advantage or benefit, but to benefit his people, benefit the purposes of God and his people. And that's the story of Nehemiah, and there's a lot we can gain from it. We can see him in his leadership and what he was able to do for the people of God, and the way that project worked, the opposition he encountered, and how he appropriately dealt with it. And it's because of guys like Nehemiah doing what he did that Jerusalem would be able to gain that kind of strength, so that the people in the land could continue to observe those customs and not have to go in that kind of survivalist accommodationist mode, and would preserve themselves for generations. We're so glad you joined us. If you have any questions, comments, or thoughts about Nehemiah, let us know in the comments and continue our conversation. I'm Ethan with Adventist Church of Christ, and we are a group of Christians in Los Angeles who would love to be an encouragement to you. Can we pray for you? Would you like to study the Bible with us or take a Bible correspondence course? Would you like to meet with us? Or something else we can do for you? Please let us know. Reach out to us at AdventistChurchOfChrist.org. You can also find us on social media at Adventist Church of Christ. We again thank you. May the Lord bless and keep you until we're able to meet again.